Rodney Stark, a professor of sociology and comparative religions, wrote a book on the revolutionary impact of Christianity in the first century world. The book is called The Rise of Early Christianity: How an Obscure, Marginal Jesus Movement Changed the World. And he tracks Christianity through the first 300 years or so of its existence. But this is the time when persecution was intense. And yet what we see is in the midst of overwhelming opposition, the church explodes. It just takes off. And it doesn't make a lot of sense, right? From a historical standpoint, as you look back on it, how did it happen that way? How did the church experience such growth and such impact when people like Nero were the ones wielding the power? And Christians didn't seem to have any influence. They didn't seem to have power or position. I mean, they couldn't run for office and they couldn't cast a vote. There was no religious freedom or Bill of Rights. There's no democratic system. And yet the church turned the world upside down. How do you explain that? Well, Dr. Stark gives some different examples on how the Christian Revolution happened. For one, he talks about abortion, specifically infanticide. It was common in the Roman world, it was an accepted practice that when parents had a child that they didn't want, maybe because it had physical disabilities or maybe because the baby was female, it was not uncommon for them to simply take the baby out into the woods and abandon it for wild animals to find or for strange and perverted people to come along and retrieve. But the early Christians saw this and said, you know what, we're not going to do it that way. And in fact, they did more than refuse to practice this. They actually went to where the children had been abandoned and they rescued the children. They raised them in their own homes. And this is how the very first orphanages were established, in the homes of Christians. Now, not only did the church protect children, but it also valued women. Rather than see women as property, the church started to give women worth. In the church, Christian men were called upon to love their wives as equal partners in the grace of God. In 1 Peter is going to give some instructions to husbands about how they should love their wives. And his words would have been, completely countercultural. They would have been revolutionary to his listeners. Here's what Peter says in verse 7. Husbands, love your wives as partners. Be considerate as you live with your wives and treat them with respect as the weaker vessel and as heirs with you in the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. We read that and we think, well, okay, sure. I mean, obviously husbands should love their wives as equal partners. But listen, at this time in history, when Peter's writing these words, well, that's completely foreign. It's an utterly ridiculous idea. The thought of being considerate, showing respect, seeing wives as equal partners and heirs together would have been unheard of. In Roman cultures especially, wives were seen as property. They were treated as objects that mostly exist for the pleasure of men. And we hear that and we think, well, maybe we haven't progressed as much as we think. In early Rome, young ladies would often be forced to marry even before puberty. But the church came in and said, we're going to treat young ladies differently. Widows at that time were typically forced to remarry because they didn't have a way to provide for themselves. But the church came in and said to widows, you know what? We're going to figure this out together. You don't have to remarry. We'll help take care of you. So Peter is talking to the church about a new day and how women are going to be treated. And he's telling husbands it's a new day for you men and how you treat your wives. And for us husbands, let's be honest, we often need a new day, right? A new day where we can be considerate, a new day where we can honor our wives and put her desires above our own, a new day to show respect the way she deserves and to listen and value her when she speaks. It's a new day, Peter says, to treat your wife as partners in the gospel, at work, at home, in the church. And so Peter says, this is the way you should be living, but why? Why do you do this? He says, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. You don't just do this for the good of your marriage, though it's good for your marriage. You don't just do this because it's a practical counsel on how to be a good husband, but he says you do this so that nothing will hinder your prayers. Do you know when this connection between prayer and honoring wives started to make sense to me? It's when I had 3 daughters, because as a father of 3 girls, I just understand this verse. I understand it completely. I love my daughters, and though I'm a fairly congenial guy, right, I can tell you this, If some man would be ugly or rude to one of my daughters, if some guy raised his voice and called one of them names, if a man treated one of my daughters with disrespect or ridicule, he and I are gonna have a serious problem, right? I mean, if God forbid one of my daughters ever married a man who hurt her or called her names or harshly laid a hand on her, then it's not gonna go well. But imagine for a moment that there's a man like that in one of their lives, and then that man comes and asks me for assistance. How do you think I'm gonna respond? Well, I'm gonna shut him down, right? Why? Because it's my daughter that we're talking about. My point is, husbands, you are married to one of God's daughters. Do you really think that you can just treat her harshly and he doesn't notice? Do you really think you can mock and ridicule her? Do you really think you can grab her and push her around and God's gonna be like, well, okay, I guess that's all right? Not a chance. Peter reminds husbands to love and value your wives, to honor their desires above your own, to treat her with respect and gentleness so that nothing will hinder your prayers and so that you can be a light in this world. Here's what he says to the wives in chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. In verse 1, he says, wives, in the same way, you submit yourselves to your own husbands so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words. But instead, they'll be won over by the behavior of their wives when they see the purity and the reverence of your lives. For some wives, this idea of submitting to their husbands, this is not welcoming words, right? And maybe there's a good reason for that. To be clear, Peter's not commanding wives to suffer or to accept abuse. It's not what's happening here. If that's the situation you're in, then you should get out and you should get help. However, for most wives, the words that Peter speaks are just hard to hear because they're challenging. And Peter talks about submission, and what he's really talking about here is respect, that your submission and respect in marriage will build your husband's faith. And as his faith grows, you'll be the one who'll benefit from it. As your husband grows in his love for God, you will see it and you will feel it and you will love it. So husbands, one of the things I would challenge you with is you need to take the lead in this. You're instructed to love your wives and honor them, treat them with respect, but think of it as a dance and you're asked to take the lead. You're asked to initiate this new approach to marriage by loving your wife the way that Jesus has loved you. And when she feels loved, valued, and honored, then submission becomes much more of a privilege and much less of a burden. But wives, even if he doesn't take the lead, then you're still called to submit. I know one wife said to me, I'll submit when he starts making better decisions. I'll be respectful when he does something to earn my respect. But that's not what Peter's saying here. Instead, he's calling you to humility and to remember that you're really not doing this for him. You're doing this for Jesus, to honor Christ and to be a light in this world. So how we live with each other as husband and wife should be different than the way the world does it. It's an incredible opportunity for us to have a powerful testimony. After asking wives to yield to their husbands, Peter goes on to provide some really freeing statements for women. He says, your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles and the wearing of gold jewelry or fine clothes. Rather, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. He says in verse 5, this is the way the holy women of the past who put their hope in God used to adorn themselves. So I'm thinking that maybe this advice for women, for wives, is more important today than ever before, right? In the days of cleansing facials and body wraps and salt scrubs and European coloring and all kinds of hair products sold on Amazon. Wives, your beauty doesn't come from those things. It doesn't come from Gucci or Prada or Lululemon or Forever 21. And Peter doesn't say those things are wrong. He just makes the point that you're free from them, that your beauty, your confidence, your value as a person shouldn't come from outward adornment. So you're free to adorn yourself with hope in God. Adorn yourself with the peace and the joy and the kindness of the Holy Spirit. This is what will ultimately make you beautiful to your husband. Christian wives, you have an incredible opportunity in our world today to display the good news of the gospel through your spirit of humble submission to your husband. If you do that, trust me, the world will take notice. So husbands and wives, honor God. Honor God by honoring each other. Submit to God by submitting to one another. Husbands, love your wives. Wives, respect your husbands. Seek first and foremost to obey God by serving one another. Rodney Stark wrote about the early rise of Christianity, about how the Jesus movement changed the world by living differently, by caring for others, by loving others. Christians changed the world through their marriages, through their parenting, through their community and relationships. It attracted a watching world to come to Christ. And listen, I believe that this can happen again. I really believe that this can happen again. And husbands and wives, it can start in your marriage.